Okay, so we're going to be talking about intentional torts today. These can be categorized into trespass. So trespass requires an intentional wrong. It can't be completed negligently. That was decided in Lee Tang and Cooper. So here the claimant was sunbathing and the defendant accidentally drove over their legs. The claimant brought the claim under trespass because they were outside of the limitation time for negligence. It was held that they couldn't do this because the injury was inflicted negligently. You can't bring a claim under trespass where there is negligence. It's an intentional tort. So this brings us on to the limitation period, where we can look on the screen. It says, so it's 3 years for negligence to bring a claim and then 6 years for trespass. I think you can look at this big gap and think that this is probably done for fairness, because in negligence it was an accidental injury. The defendant didn't mean to do so, whereas in trespass they've acted with malice, they've intentionally done this, and I think the courts are holding them to a strict standard so that you're able to claim against them for this malicious action. So the first tort we're going to look at is assault. So this is where there is direct threat or attempt from the defendant to cause the claimant to suffer reasonable apprehension of harm. This is distinct from battery as there's no requirement for touching, so anything like verbal abuse can be caught under assault. A good example is R Island. So here the defendant was making silent phone calls to the claimant, and this was done with the intention of causing her to fear harm, which she did, and assault was found here. So there's 3 requirements. The first is reasonable apprehension of harm. You can refer to Stephen and Myers for this. So the defendant and the claimant were arguing that it got intense. The defendant had a clenched fist and he was being held back by multiple people from the claimant. And here it was held that the claimant can't reasonably believe that they're going to be harmed where the defendant is being held back from them. The second requirement is that it has to be intentional. This goes into the fact that these are intentional torts. There need be intent. Simple as. Third of all, it must be immediate and direct. So here we can refer to Tuberville and Savage. So it said, if not for period of peace, I would have taken a sword up against you. Here it was held that the sentence itself, it's clearly conditional, if not for, meaning that because we are in this period of peace, I'm not going to do this. It's clear. It's irrelevant that it would have been, if this period ends, then I'm going to suffer this harm. It has to be immediate, it has to be direct. Assault is quite similar to battery, however, in battery, you require touching. Battery is defined as the unlawful beating of another. And again, here there are 3 requirements. The first is that the force must be applied intentionally. Here we can refer to R and Fagan. So in this case, the defendant drove over a police officer's foot, didn't realise. However, once they realised that their tyre was on their foot, they didn't move the car. From that moment, the intent had been found. They intended to keep the car there. They intended to cause the police officer harm. Okay. The second requirement is that the force must be applied direct. So here we can refer to Scott and Shepherd. So the defendant threw a lit firework inside a marketplace, and this lit firework kept being thrown around until it exploded. Here the case was brought against the person who initially threw the firework. They may have not intended for it to explode in that place, in that moment, whatever, but they were the direct reason why that firework was thrown in the marketplace in the first place. We then require immediate force to be applied. And 2 cases here. One is Wilson and Pringle. So in this case, there were schoolboys, they were pulling each other's backpacks, and one was injured. And here it was seen that we have to judge this objectively. You require hostile touching. Here it was just a case where boys were fooling around. It wasn't anything hostile. The same applied to Inns. There was hostile touching in order to prevent entrance to a certain area. This blocking can constitute battery. We then move on to false imprisonment. So there are 3 requirements for this. The first is that there has to be a complete restriction of freedom. So in Bird and Jones, I think they went halfway through a bridge, they were stopped, and they were told to go back. This isn't a complete restriction of freedom. They managed to move a certain amount, they weren't stopped from going anywhere. It has to be a complete restriction, it's quite a high standard. Second of all, it's not really a requirement, but more a fact. The claimant doesn't have to know they're being imprisoned. So in Iqbal and Prison Officers Association, the prison guards went on a strike, and so there was no one in the system who let prisoners out to have their breaks. They were being kept inside their cells. And here the courts held that this was an omission, it wasn't an act. Third of all, it needs to be without legal authorization. The defendant has to prove, this burden's on the defendant, they have to prove that they held the legal authority to detain the claimant. We can now look at intentional infliction of physical or emotional harm. This is where there was intention to do something, but something else was indirectly caused. So this is really shown well by Wilkinson and Downton. So the defendant wants to play a practical joke on the claimant, and they go to the claimant, they're like, oh my god, your husband's been in a really bad accident, they suffered a lot of harm, and the claimant suffers shock, and due to this shock she suffers many health consequences. And the court held that it was irrelevant that they didn't intend to cause this, it was still a result of their actions, an intentional action that they completed. Wilkinson isn't used often, but what Wilkinson did was allow protection from harassment when it wasn't available. So the Protection from Harassment Act was only introduced in 1997. In I don't know how to say that, Ambush, it's a 1993 case. And there was an 18-year-old, she was dating someone 10 years older than her. They broke up, and the defendant began harassing her. And she didn't own the house, and so the only option she would have had was nuisance, which was unavailable as she wasn't a homeowner. So using the Wilkinson rule, they allowed her to get an injunction so that she could be protected from this harassment. We no longer need to rely on Wilkinson because we have the Protection from Harassment Act of 1997. It defines what harassment is and enables protection from it. It's in the name. Lastly, we're going to look at defences. So first of all, there's illegality. You can refer to Murphy and Culhane here. So the claimant was killed in a gang fight, and for this the damages were reduced. This also refers back to contributory negligence. Secondly, we can look at unlawful arrest and detention. Third of all, consent. Fourth, necessity. This has quite a high threshold. So in F and West Berkshire Health Authority, they sterilised a woman. She had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. Mentally, she was 7. She might have been a grown woman, but again, mentally, she was a lot younger. And had she ended up pregnant, it would have done extensive damage to her mental health. And so that's why they were allowed to sterilise her. It shows how high a threshold is required to use necessity. And you should make sure that if you're using this in a problem question, your facts amount to that. Fifth, there's self-defense. So in battery, if you hit someone after they hit you, they can't claim against you for it because you were defending yourself. And then lastly, contributory negligence, where we refer to again Murphy and Culhane. They were in a gang, they contributed to that environment, the situation that went down, and so their damages were reduced because of that. It's a partial defense.